The murder of Nancy Chadwick in 1948 interests many criminologists. What led her killer to brutally end her life? Was it greed, uncontrollable anger, or a mental disorder? Perhaps all of these factors contributed to the crime? Some authors have described the slaying as mindless and motiveless. Others suggest that Mrs. Chadwick was killed on a whim and see it as a baffling enigma, the work of an unstable and erratic person who is beyond rational evaluation. Margaret Allen, her killer, was a troubled and gender-confused individual. In more modern times, she would have been seen as a transsexual and could have looked help for her problems. But Allen was born in 1906. She was part of an immense working-class family, the 20th child of 22 offspring, and lived in an age when people like herself were not understood. From an early age, she denied her own femininity and strove to act in a masculine manner. Allen preferred the company of burly male workers in her hometown Rawtenstall in Lancashire, England, where she took the jobs usually given to men. She loaded coal, repaired houses and became a bus conductor. Unfortunately, her desire to adopt male traits led her to swear, act aggressively and resort to physical violence. The bus company fired her for abusing passengers. Customers who didn't take their seats quickly enough were likely to be verbally assaulted, shoved and cuffed. In 1935, Allen claimed that she checked into a hospital for what she described as a delicate operation. Later, she suggested that the purpose of this procedure had been to change her from a woman to a man. It seems likely that Allen was being untruthful about, or at least exaggerating, the nature of any treatment she received. Perhaps she so desperately wanted to change her gender, and be accepted as a man, that she sought to convince herself and others that she had been physically altered. Whatever the real facts of the matter were, after asserting that she'd had the operation, Allen made no pretense about her turnabout sexual role. She called herself Bill, cut her hair short, donned male clothes and drank in public houses and working men's clubs. She had no female friends except for Mrs. Annie Cook. Allen apparently saw this lady as a potential girlfriend, but their relationship stalled when Allen took Mrs. Cook on vacation and asked to have sex with her. The offended Mrs. Cook refused and made it clear that she had no interest in Allen as a lover. In 1943, when her mother died, Allen was badly affected and she became even more withdrawn from normal social activities. Her smoking became excessive, she didn't eat properly, allowed herself to become unkempt and went through bouts of bleak depression. Allen invested her savings in the purchase of a dilapidated building that once served as Rawtenstall's police headquarters, situated on the town's main street, Backup Road. She lived alone, and according to Mrs. Cook, Allen tried to kill herself on at least one occasion with gas. On August 28, 1948, 68-year-old widow Mrs. Nancy Ellen Chadwick, a disagreeable local eccentric, knocked on Allen's door. Although evidently not poor, Chadwick, who was known to carry large sums of money around in a bag, was a miser who would rather scrounge off others than spend her own cash. The next day Chadwick's body was found on the road outside Allen's house. Her head had been battered. At first it was suspected that she was a hit-and-run victim. But the police later determined that her wounds had been caused by the pointed end of a coal hammer. The implement had evidently been coated with ashes. Detectives from Scotland Yard were called in. Their task was made relatively easy by a trail of blood which could be followed from the place where the corpse was found to Allen's residence. Allen blatantly dogged the investigators' footsteps, staring at them for long periods as they inspected the area. At one point, she rushed up to a detective, pulled at his sleeve and pointed to the nearby River Irwell, declaring, "Look, there's something there." The object floating in the water was Mrs. Chadwick's bag. As the police delved with calm deliberation, Margaret Allen, perhaps made overconfident by their methodical approach and intent on being the center of attention, barged into the local pub and declared, "I was the last person to see the old woman." For 2 days she returned to the bar to drink stout and share her opinions about the crime with other drinkers and increasingly curious journalists. She was an old fool to sit on a roadside bench counting her money, Allen stated, revealingly to her listeners. She also let it be known that the victim had been wearing an underskirt with a hidden pocket. When the police called at her home on September 1, 1948, they noticed bloodstains on an inside wall close to the doorway. A short search of the building yielded enough evidence to convict Allen of the Chadwick murder. More blood marks were in the cellar. The investigators matched the hairs from the head of the victim to Allen's clothing and discovered several effects belonging to Chadwick. It only remained for Allen to confess. When formally charged, Margaret Allen admitted to killing the old woman. "I was in a funny mood. She seemed to insist on coming in. I just happened to look around and saw a hammer in the kitchen. On the spur of the moment I hit her. She gave me a shout and that seemed to start me off more, and I hit her a few times, I don't know how many." She gave no other explanation. At her trial, which barely lasted 5 hours, despite attempts by her counsel to prove her insane, Allen was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was hanged on the 12th of January 1949 by public executioner Albert Pierre Point, the first female execution in Britain for 12 years and only the third at Strangeways Prison. Her friend Mrs. Cook created a petition to ask for a commutation, but only 162 people, out of the town's population of almost 30,000, signed it. In the condemned cell, Margaret Allen was belligerent and argumentative to the end. She complained about the lack of creature comforts afforded by the prison, and when brought her last meal, scrambled eggs, she kicked the tray, scattering the food and remarking, "At least no one else will enjoy that meal."